Well, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for coming. Thanks to Mr. Sweeney and to Beth Antoine for having me out here. I'm talking about free speech on college campuses, and in particular about keeping an open mind and a humble heart once you get to college. As many of you have probably seen on the news, there are a lot of campus disruptions, a lot of sometimes chaos, a lot of protests, and I want to have you sort of gain some context and a framework for analyzing those. But first, I want to talk to you about when I went to college, which really to you may seem like a long time ago, but to me it feels as though it just happened. But I remember I got to college, and there was orientation. And the first day, I got to my dorm room, and it was just this empty jail cell. That's what it looked like. And so I started setting up. My roommate hadn't arrived yet. I'd never met the guy in my life. He was from Ohio. And so I just picked, the top bunk, because I thought, well, I'll let this guy get the bottom bunk. And I just picked a desk on one side of the room. And shortly thereafter, he shows up with an entourage. He was there with all kinds of family, and they came in, and we met, and after a while, we got everything set up, and then he and I decided we were just going to go explore the building and figure out what was what and where everything was. So we walked down these steps, and there's a big kind of common space, and behind that was the laundry room. So we walk into the laundry room, and we're trying to figure out how to use these things called washers and dryers. And at the time, you actually had to put a quarter in the machine. I have no idea how they do these things now, but you had to put a quarter in the machine to use it. And as we're looking around the room, I see this thing on the wall, and it looks like a light switch. But instead of having the little flip switch, it has a button. And then above the button, there's just a little light that was green. And then below the light, there was some writing. And the writing said, "To test carbon monoxide levels, press button when the light is green." And I got to thinking, I wonder what the carbon monoxide levels are. I don't know what levels would be good or bad, but I wonder what they are. So I reached up and I pressed the button. Instantly, you just heard, the fire alarms for the whole building started going off. Now, my roommate that I just met looked at me like, "What? Are you crazy? What are you doing? I can't believe you just set the fire alarm." I said, "I just pressed this button." Then we happened to be right outside the hallway where the football players lived. And they came out and they were mad. And they were like, "I can't believe someone turned the fire alarm off. If we find out who did this." And the guy who I just met him turns, looks at me and says, "Don't say a word. Don't say anything." And so rather than evacuating the building with everyone else, because we knew there was no fire, we knew there was no problem, we slipped back the other way and went up into our rooms and just closed the door and said, "We'll just wait it out." Well, before we had done that, we decided just to decorate our room. This was earlier in the afternoon with just kind of a bunch of nonsense stuff. So we went to Walmart and we bought all kinds of signs. Like there was a stop sign and an exit sign and a men's bathroom sign and all kinds of little signs. And we plastered them all over the door. For some reason, that's how we decided to decorate the door. I don't know why. It's just one of those things you do when you're 18 because you think it's funny. Well, as we're hunkered down in the dorm room, waiting for the fire alarm to go off and waiting for the all clear sign and for people to come back into the building, all of a sudden we get a knock on the door. Bump, 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 bump. So I walk up to the door and I open it, and there stands a fireman. And I'm thinking, oh no, now I'm going to get in trouble. Like I'm busted. I'm going to get arrested because you're supposed to evacuate a building, or they figured out that it was me who touched the button because of some sort of surveillance, and now I'm going to get in trouble. And then the guy just points to the door and said, "Oh, I thought this was the bathroom, sorry," because he saw the men's bathroom sign on the door. And then he walked away, and that was it. So I didn't get in trouble. That was my first day on a college campus. Now, about a week later was my first day of class ever. And Furman started late in the year. It's actually started in mid-September. I don't know if it still does, but we were on trimesters at the time, so it started late. And my first day of class, I remember very well. I went into my philosophy class and was pretty intimidated by the level of discourse in the class, and it was primarily upperclassmen in that class. So I felt maybe I was in over my head, but as I was leaving, I was walking back from that class, and some guy came up to me and said, "Hey, have you seen what happened this morning?" I'm like, "No, I just was in class. What are you talking about?" He said, "You got to go to the TV right now. Some planes hit the World Trade Center." It's like, wait, what's the World Trade Center? He's like, those two big buildings in New York. These planes have hit the Twin Towers, and like there was a restaurant up there, and all kinds of crazy stuff is happening. I thought, what in the world are you talking about? So I went back to my dorm room, and this guy was going to class. Classes hadn't been canceled or anything like that. It was just very much an ongoing situation. And I turned on the TV, and I was sitting there watching, and about 5 minutes after I was sitting there watching, I started seeing people hurling their bodies out of windows, and I saw bodies falling to the ground. I thought, wow, like what a tremendous weight to be my first day of college ever. I was excited. I couldn't wait to get to my class. I couldn't wait to study. And this just brought a complete new view to what I was doing in college. It sort of was one of these momentous events where you suddenly put everything into context. And my dad had been traveling to New York that day, and I couldn't get a hold of him on the phone, so I didn't know if he was okay. And suddenly everything that I thought was important, fitting in at college, having a good time at college, studying, really minimized in importance. I realized, I'm here to learn. Like, I'm here to study, and not just to have a good time, not just to make friends, but really to live a good life. And that's the purpose of education, really, is to live a good life and to help other people with the knowledge that you acquire while you're studying. So it's difficult to impart that sense of gravity to people who don't have such an enormous and disturbing situation on their first day of school, right? But I'll try to talk about sort of the purpose of higher education a little bit, and why I believe freedom of speech is important to the acquisition of knowledge. I mentioned earlier that you see a lot of protests and things like that on college campuses, but you also see speech codes, safe spaces, deplatforming, trigger warnings, disinvitations, silencing speakers. And these, to me, are signs of illiberal and intolerant policies. They prioritize indoctrination, orthodoxy, conformity, narrow-mindedness, censorship, and dogmatism over the pursuit of knowledge and the wide dissemination of ideas. Now, humor me for a minute. I want everyone to take your finger up and like pick a point on the ceiling and then draw a circle clockwise around that point. All right. Look up at a point and hold your hand up by your eyes, yeah, and draw a circle clockwise. All right. Now keep your finger moving clockwise in that direction and bring it down to your chest. Keep doing it exactly the same. Down the chest. Now look at your finger. Which way is your finger moving? Did it change directions? No, it didn't change directions. Your finger's still moving in the same direction, but your perspective has changed, right? When you're up here, clockwise looks one way, and then it comes down here, changes direction. Like, try this. All right, we're going clockwise. You see clockwise, but what would somebody on that side see? They would see the opposite. So my point is that sometimes you need to keep in mind that your perspective influences what you see. That sometimes what you take to be absolutely 100% true may not look the same way to somebody else. It was true that you were moving that circle clockwise, but it was also true that you were moving that circle counterclockwise. You had two truths simultaneously in existence that all depended on perspective. Now, there was a British philosopher, political economist, classical liberal, utilitarian, member of parliament named John Stuart Mill. He was an abolitionist on the slavery issue. He advocated women's suffrage. And he was a 19th century guy. And he was an advocate of the free and open exchange of ideas. And he had three main reasons for this. Reasons that you don't want to suppress speech with which you disagree. Reasons you ought to try to hear competing viewpoints. Reasons why you ought to invite debate rather than shutting it down. The first one is that however controversial ideas may seem, they might actually be right. So just because something is controversial doesn't mean that it's automatically wrong. The sort of classic example of this is if you look back at Galileo, and he advocated heliocentrism, which is the idea that the planets revolved around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the earth. And this was considered heresy, that, wow, the earth is the center of the universe. So that's the classic example. I'll start with just sort of a more mundane example, which is when I was a kid, my grandmother had a dog. It was a little Shih Tzu. Scared some of you for a second, didn't you? It was a little Shih Tzu, and it fit in a bucket. And all my friends and I think we must have been 6 or 7 years old. We were playing in the playground, and my next door neighbor and his little brother decided to put this poor dog in the bucket and send him down the slide. And they were doing this over and over again. And my mom saw us from the kitchen window, and she came running out, and she said, stop doing that right now. And everyone was getting in trouble. My friends got sent home, and she said, Alan, I can't believe you would send that dog down the slide like that. And my defense was, your eyes made you see something that didn't happen. That's what I said. Your eyes made you see something that didn't happen. She thought that was actually a funny response. But my point was, I didn't send the dog down the slide. It wasn't my idea. I didn't do it. That was their idea. It was my friend's idea, Jared and Brad in particular. If you ever run into them, you'll have to hold them accountable. But it was their idea. They were the ones that sent the dog down the slide. It wasn't me. And this was a situation that I took to be like, well, if she had gained my perspective on the situation, I wouldn't be getting in trouble. I was not the guilty one. Of course, her argument was that you ought to have stepped in and stopped it. It was your responsibility. It was your grandmother's dog. You should have stopped your friends from doing something bad to it. But because we didn't explain our positions to each other, we didn't actually gain an understanding of each other's perspective. So number one, Mill, however controversial ideas may be, they're not wrong just because they're controversial. They may be right. Number two, even if we are right about what we believe, so even if you do hold a position that turns out to be true, you refine your understanding of it. You have a better sense of it if you subject it to the scrutiny of others. So you actually improve your ideas by pitting them against opposition, right? I mean, how often have you been challenged to defend something that you hold dear? I mean, whether it be a religious belief or a political belief or whatever it is, but the act of having yourself challenged means what? You have to go research. You have to go figure out the reasons why you believe it is what you believe. I mean, in my view, the right way to acquire a belief is to do it through, evidence gathering in the process, right? You don't just believe something and then try to prove it later. You believe something because it's been proven to you and you've actually undergone the process of inquiry to ascertain that belief. But by arguing with somebody you disagree with, and I say arguing in the sense of a civil argument. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so arguing is not actually a bad word in the law. Arguing just means you're having a conversation about something on which you disagree. But I have a friendship with a guy named Ashby Pate, and he and I have very different political views. And he's in Birmingham, and he and I talk all the time about politics, and we couldn't disagree more. But we are able to do so civilly. We're able to do so as friends. We're able to do so in good faith. We're not out to try to convert the other person to our views, but just to have a conversation. It's always constantly, I want him to see where I'm coming from, and I want him to see why it is I believe what I believe. And he wants the same thing, vice versa. And I believe I have a much deeper understanding of his positions because of this process, and that he has a much deeper understanding of my positions. The last reason that John Stuart Mill advocates for free expression, open inquiry, and not suppressing the speech of others is that we may find that what we think to be totally opposing views contain some nuggets of truth in them, that they may not be completely wrong, but they may be partially wrong, but there may be parts of it that are actually right. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't fully engage with the other idea. So you've heard the expression, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's why I'm not a fan of history that goes something like this, like, oh, this person's really bad, so we throw that person's thought out and everything that person did is bad. And then this person's really good, so we do everything this person said. I tend to find that human beings are much more complex than just sort of these one-dimensional caricatures that we see often in the media or in sort of amateur histories, but that there are complicated dynamics at play. People change their views, they change their minds, they take different positions, and that if you really take the time to explore, you'll find, oh, there may be some things that I actually agree with. So my message to you, I guess in short, is be humble and open-minded, be tolerant and receptive. There's a poem by Robert Frost. Does everyone know who Robert Frost was? He was a New England poet. You probably read him in your English classes, but I want to set the scene for you in this poem. So imagine rural New England out there. It's in some kind of woods, and it's cold. There's snow on the ground. The snow is actually falling, and it's very dark, and there's a man and his horse, and they're all alone out there. And so the poem begins like this. This is the speaker. This is the old man speaking. He says, "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." So as you sit here today in high school, my goodness, what I wouldn't do to be back in high school again. How awesome it would be to be 17 or 18 years old, right at the prime of life where you've got everything to look forward to. You've got miles to go before you sleep. And you look at the chaos on TV, you look at the news, and everything looks bad, it looks crazy, it looks disorienting. And it is easy to be drawn to the darkness, to just say, there's so much suffering. I just want to stay out here in the woods by myself. I just want to be isolated. I don't want to go on anymore. It's hard trudging through this snow and the darkness. But you've got miles to go before you sleep. You've got an entire lifetime ahead of you. Think about how much of an impact you're going to make on people's lives. And there really has never in human history been a better time to be alive. Think about what you've got right here in your hand. In this iPhone, you contain more data, more information than any physical library that's ever existed in human history. You've got all kinds of opportunity. You've got unparalleled access to medicine, high quality of life, institutions that would not have even been dreamed of a little over a century ago. You can hop on a plane and be anywhere in the country before the day's out. This is amazing. We are living in an amazing time. At any instant, you can have a conversation in real time with anybody on this planet. That is absolutely astounding. We should be amazed. We take it for granted because we've grown up with it and we're gotten used to technology, but it is amazing the world we live in. And I would submit to you that if you come to college with an open mind and you are tolerant of other views and you want to come with a commitment to listen to other people you disagree with, you'll be able to make this world an even better place. That those are the types of things that enable human progress and advancement. That shouting people down, not letting them speak, deprives them of the opportunity to give you a point of view, a perspective that you may not have had before. And you may come later to appreciate that point of view. You may change your mind. You may learn more. And so I would encourage you, when you do go to college, to be open-minded and to listen to other views and to really challenge yourself to be a better person through that process. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time. Any questions? Yeah, sure.
Well, I came late to your talk.
Sure.
So philosophy-wise, do you have a particular favorite philosophy to study?
Well, that's a loaded question. I would encourage you to study all the philosophies that you can and get a diverse viewpoint. I mean, I've arrived at certain positions. I consider myself a political libertarian, but I was not always that. I was actually a person of the left when I was in college. I was a Democrat, and I sort of changed my views and went a different direction. When I first got to college, I had an English professor who said, you ought to join the college Republicans and the college Democrats and join them both. And really, until you figure out, because you're 18 years old, you really don't know what you believe. You haven't read enough. You haven't learned enough. It's just not possible at 18, unless you are John Stuart Mill. I mentioned John Stuart Mill earlier. His dad was an adherent of this philosophy called associationism. And he believed that exposing his child, John Stuart Mill, to other children would make his child dumber. So he just isolated John Stuart Mill from other children and forced him to be only around adults that talked about big ideas and taught him to read Greek at 3 and basically just tried to make him into this child genius. But that I do not advocate. But no, I think that because by the time you're 18, you can't possibly read enough or know enough to really settle into a firm belief that you ought to be able to explore a little bit. Read somebody that you think you would strongly oppose and try to figure out why it is you oppose them without having someone tell you why. Without having someone say, well, here's point A, B, C, D, and E, and why this person's bad. Go and figure it out on your own. Read it and see if something might seem reasonable to you. Now, I can recommend different economists, but these are all these are all how I eventually came to love people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and people like that. But that was a process of exploration. I didn't know a thing about economics before I started reading those people on my own. And all the poets I love, they would have radically different viewpoints from me on the economics that I adhere to. I can still like Robert Frost, even though I don't think he really had a sense of what kind of an economist he was, but I can still love his poetry because his poetry is beautiful. This is that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because Robert Frost wouldn't have held my economic views doesn't mean I can't read his poetry and enjoy his poetry and find a lot of truth and a lot of helpful stuff and beautiful stuff in it. Yeah, other questions?
Do you think the First Amendment on college campuses is being threatened more than ever?
Well, I would have to qualify that by saying public campuses, because it's a different thing if you're talking about private and public institutions, right? Because the First Amendment is only going to apply to these public institutions. And I do think that, yeah, it's being threatened. The First Amendment, it's a complex issue because if you take what the First Amendment says on its face, it's tough to square that with the time, place, and manner restrictions and all this jurisprudence that is built up over years and years and years and decades. But in short, if we're just talking principally about the concept of freedom of speech, freedom of association, then yes, I do feel that it's being threatened on college campuses, and I think it's being threatened to the detriment of our future as a country and our future as human beings. I think that our nation still remains one of the places where freedom of speech and expression is welcomed. And I fear for our future if we can't retain that. I mean, that's one of the things that's really made living where we live, an exceptional experience, something that set us apart. And it's dangerous to have, in particular, government picking and choosing which ideas are good, which ideas are bad, what can be said, what can't be said. That stuff should be left to the social processes as, people compete over ideas and exchange ideas freely and test them out in the real world on a local level. So yeah, to answer your question, I do feel that freedom of speech is being undermined and jeopardized on college campuses.
Do you think it's only in the classroom, or do you think it's outside the classroom as well?
I think it's inside and outside the classroom. One thing that you see a lot is the deplatforming of speakers. You'll see people invited, and then they'll be disinvited. And part of that has to do with, because of the conditions are as they are, because freedom of speech is threatened, you have certain people that want to bring in the most provocative speaker they can to make a political statement. Now, that I would also advise against. If you're the type of person that wants to invite a speaker, you can invite someone that's controversial, but try to invite someone that's going to reason in good faith and is actually interested in achieving some sort of dialogue, some sort of civil dialogue, or somebody that is actually trying to reach the truth, that's, as I say, arguing in good faith. Don't just pick someone who's a blowhard that's going to go up there and just say horrible things and just to be controversial. That's not really, controversy in itself is not necessarily constructive. But controversy in the service of the pursuit of truth is a different thing. So I would say, if you're in the position to invite speakers, try to invite somebody that is interested in advancing human society, who wants to genuinely improve the lives and institutions of others. But at the same time, if somebody does get invited that you disapprove of, go there and challenge the speaker. Listen to what that person says, take notes, and press them on it. If they can't defend themselves and you embarrass that person in front of a group of people, then everyone's going to say, oh, this person's bunk. These ideas are wrong. So use your mind, challenge yourself and challenge those people you disagree with. If they can't defend their positions in a rational way, then their positions, you're justified in not being persuaded by, their argument in favor of those positions. So.
What were your thoughts? Wasn't it a couple years ago when Richard Spencer came to Auburn? What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, that's kind of an example of somebody that I would advise people against bringing to campus. I don't think he offers very many constructive views, and I sort of disliked the way that was handled. Now, that case ended up going before Judge Keith Watkins of the Middle District, where there was an attempt to prevent the speaker from coming. And I think based on the law, Keith Watkins arrived at the right position, which is that he was required to come as a public institution. They had a legitimate invitation to him, and so they had to have him come. But the event ended up being kind of a nothing, because he wanted to come and be provocative and cause all these problems, and really it didn't happen. So no one was persuaded by his views. No one thought his views. And what ended up happening is people did challenge him, and he came across looking kind of stupid. People challenged him, and that's the way to fight back, is you fight back with ideas. You fight back and you challenge his positions. And if you're not prepared to do that, then that's what college is for. You need to go out and read and study so that you are equipped to take people down on their views. And if their views are bad, you need to be able to tell them why they're bad, and you need to be able to defend your position. And that's what college equips you to do when you get there. That's what you ought to use the occasion for, is really boning up on history and philosophy and political theory, everything you can get your hands on. Read it all. Read as much as you can read, because you're only on this planet for a very short time, and there are thousands of books. You could never even read, a needle in a haystack's worth of the books that there are out there to read. And I would just say, come in with just a ravenous appetite for learning and just devour as much as you can while you're in college, because you'll never have that sort of leisure again to do it. Life gets a lot more difficult and complicated once you get out in the real world and you start supporting yourself, and then you got to support a family, and then you've got to work, but time just seems to be in abundance when you're in college. At least it was for me. So I would encourage you to use that time reading and writing as much as possible. rather than just partying or whatever it is that you would do for recreation. Because ultimately, the one thing people can't take from you are your ideas. People can take the clothes off your back, they can take your house, they can take but they can never take your mind from you without, eliminating you as a person. So cherish those things, to cultivate the mind. It's the most important thing you've got. And it's one of those things that, I don't understand how you could go through life not chasing after knowledge, not chasing after learning. It would seem to be such a waste. There's just so much opportunity to understand the world in which we live and to make it a better place, that why would you deprive yourself of that opportunity? And college is the place to really get started on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so kind of related to what you're talking about, but should social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram be able to regulate what is on their websites or on their platforms?
Wow, that's an extremely complex question. So those are private companies, and the First Amendment does not reach into the private companies. So if you start a private company and you want to limit the content of speech through government, then or if government wants to eliminate your speech, that's problematic. I find it problematic to use the power of government, the cursive arm of the state, to try to restrict any private speech. Now, if you look at these companies, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, Instagram, Instagram is Facebook, but a lot of these social media platforms, you'll find that you can look where they're getting some federal funding in places. And then it becomes problematic, because then is the government thereby endorsing, is the government funding the deprivation of speech or the silencing of speech? And that's a more difficult question to get to. But the other thing is, let's say you're someone on the right and you decide you want, Sessions' DOJ to try to go after these sort of tech companies. And, you risk, what you risk doing is then, let's say a Democratic administration comes up and they want to use the same powers against Fox News. Then you're going to think that's a bad idea. So I find it bad you build up this giant power apparatus of government in Washington, D.C. And let's just imagine that rather than calling it that, let's just say you build up this giant death machine. What if there was a big death machine and you had two political parties fighting over who could get control of it so that they could each use it against the other? That's a dangerous situation, So as power tends to amass in some of these centralized institutions in Washington, D.C., different people can gain control of it and use it in different ways. You actually see Donald Trump doing a lot of the things that he actually learned to do from Barack Obama. And I think some people on the left are now saying, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that because we created a precedent for someone like Donald Trump to use it now. And so maybe we should all have, tried to minimize the capabilities of someone in the executive branch to do that at all, because it was okay when someone we liked did it, but now someone we don't like is doing it, and now it's bad. And both parties, they flip. They just keep doing that. But the power seems to keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger because everyone wants to weaponize the government against the people they disagree with. And that is a very dangerous escalation in my view. And I don't really have any simple ideas about how to go about solving that. But it's a complicated issue, and one that is definitely worth thinking about as when you're in college. Absolutely.
How would you describe the role of the press in our society?
Well, I think the press serves an indispensable function in challenging people to stick to facts, challenging people to verify their data, and keeping politicians honest, not just politicians, but government leaders honest. So I think the press plays an indispensable function in that. The one thing that I've noticed over my lifetime is that the presentation of facts has tended to become more politically narrated than it used to be. You used to get more of sort of a plain statement of fact than you do today. And now everyone's sort of falling into their own echo chambers and into their own silos, and they're presenting information in a way that favors a particular audience. And so CNN wants to get this particular audience. Fox News wants to get this particular audience. MSNBC wants to get this particular audience. And no matter who it is, you'll find someone out there that will present it to whatever audience they're looking for. They're looking at their consumer base and trying to do. Now, I'm not saying media was always unbiased. At some time there was always media bias, but I'm just saying that now people don't really try to hide it. Now everybody's pretty open about where they stand, and that can be good and bad. I think it's good to have sort of a diversity of platforms. I think it's good for people to be skeptical about the news that they get. I think it's always good to be skeptical. But where it's problematic is just determining which sources you trust and which sources you don't. And that's something everyone has to work out on their own. But again, I would encourage you to read and watch a variety of perspectives and a variety of commentators until you really figure out what you think is right, not because it affirms what you already believe, but because it seems rationally true. A lot of times you have to separate the emotion from the reason. You really do have to say, all right, I'm going to pretend I'm a blank slate, a tabula rasa right here as I come at this program, and I'm going to view this as objectively as I can and try to see what the facts are and what views I agree with and what I don't. And it's an exercise. It's hard because we are so emotionally bound up. It's not like we just spring out of a vacuum in which no ideas existed. We're embedded creatures. We are informed by culture and custom, and we're socialized by families and friends and institutions. And so we can't just come with a blank slate, but we can perform the exercise where we attempt to do so, just to come at programs with as open a mind as you can, just to see if you can figure out that maybe I might be wrong about something. I think it's always good to be humble about how much you know, because there's just so much information out there that no one person or group of people could ever know it all, and that's why it's important to at times be deferential to people that do know more than you do, and to seek wisdom where it exists. And I'm not sure that media is necessarily the place where you find a lot of wisdom, but it is a place where you see a lot of just day-to-day facts. And just being aware of how those facts are packaged and presented will be helpful. Just knowing that, okay, I'm going to watch this to see what narrative they're trying to present to me, because they're going to come with an angle. Facts are rarely ever coming as just naked facts. They're getting dressed up in all kinds of contexts and assumptions. And so just being aware that that's how the media is sending his message to you is important. I mean, yeah. I don't think we exist in a state where, you had government controlled media that's just spitting out government propaganda or anything like that. But that's been a problem in some places throughout history as well. So any more questions?
Last one.
Sure.
Hopefully.
Sure.
So which one would you say should be valued more? The public's right to know or the right to privacy? Or is it conditional?
So it depends on what kind of context. Are you talking about someone's, like, a politician's or government officials' personal, like, let's say their sex life or something like that? Is that kind of what you're referring to? Or
Just like in general, like what things
or like their taxes or something like that? Or
what things should be fair game for like public access and what things shouldn't? Like if a political candidate running for office that the public should know and things they shouldn't know.
Well, there are a few different ways of answering that question. I think that the media is at liberty to investigate whatever it wants to investigate, that government shouldn't stop them from doing that. Now, consumers can choose what they want to consume and what's outside the pale and what's not. I think that's ultimately going to be a choice for consumers as to what they find distasteful, what they find to be indecorous, what they find to be inappropriate. But you also, obviously, within the bounds of the law, I mean, defamation is illegal, and there's a reason. After centuries of figuring out the consequences of false representation, libel, slander, these kinds of things, we came up with defamation laws to prevent, wrongful assertions about people. By the same token, people are obviously entitled to certain privacies. I mean, you can't go and pull the curtains back and be a peeping Tom in people's houses and things like that without violating rules. So, there's a balance there. And I'm not sure exactly where I would draw the line other than to say, if somebody chooses to be a public official and chooses to run for office, they are definitely subject to a much higher standard of conduct than someone who is not. So I think it's completely appropriate to go look to see whether this person has the right character to be in office. It's okay to do a character analysis. And if this person fails the character analysis for something they've done in the past, then maybe they've demonstrated that they're not trustworthy to be a leader. And that's totally okay. That should be done. That absolutely should be done. That's the process. That's the vetting that ought to go on. But if you're talking about, like, should we go spy in people's houses and, trespass on their property to figure out what, Kate and Prince William are doing on their vacation in the Canary Islands, that's a different thing, So I don't, it's a tough question. It is very context dependent as to what the person's official capacity is, if that person is a public official, and if that person is acting in a public capacity, or whether it's just private citizens engaging in private conduct. And I think consumers are ultimately able to tell the difference, but that's a very good question, and I hope I've just sort of approached an answer. I can't give you sort of an all-encompassing, definitive answer for all times and places, but that's just sort of a tentative stab at it. Yeah. Well, how are we on time? Are we?
We're about to get ready to go back to class.
Okay.
So.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for coming.